The text message pinged, and my stomach immediately clenched. It was Caitlin, my sister. The preview read, OMG Bailey, disaster. Need to talk urgently about the anniversary party. Call me ASAP. The triple exclamation points were her signature move, usually preceding a demand that would leave my bank account whimpering. My name is Bailey, by the way, and for most of my adult life, I've been the unofficial family ATM, emotional punching bag, and general dog's body. I sighed, pushing aside a fragile 17th century manuscript I was painstakingly restoring, my supposed silly hobby, and braced myself. I'd barely hit call when her voice, high pitched and frantic, assaulted my ear. Bailey, thank God, you will not believe what happened. What is it, Caitlin? I asked, already picturing the caterer canceling or the artisanal ice sculptor melting prematurely. The string quartet, the one I booked for the garden reception, they've double booked. Can you believe the nerve? And they were the only ones who could play that obscure Vivaldi piece Noel adores. I waited. The real reason for the call was always a few dramatic flourishes away. So, she continued, her voice dropping conspiratorially, I found this amazing chamber orchestra. They're even better, honestly, but, well, they're a bit more. Like 5,000 more. 5,000. Just like that. For a string quartet upgrade at an anniversary party for a 1 year marriage. A marriage, I might add, that I'd already contributed a painful 5 figure sum towards because their dream venue was slightly out of their budget. Caitlin, I began, trying to keep my voice even. I really can't swing that right now. Things are tight. Oh, come on, Bailey. Her tone shifted from panicked to petulant. It's our first anniversary. It has to be perfect. Mum said you'd understand. She said you've always been so good at managing things. Managing things was their euphemism for bailing us out. My tiny apartment, a shoebox compared to Caitlin and Noel's sprawling suburban home, or my parents' comfortable detached house, was a testament to how much managing I'd done over the years. My biggest luxury was a specialized humidifier that kept my precious manuscripts from crumbling, not designer bags or European holidays. Mum said that, did she? I murmured, picturing Vivian, my mother, waving a dismissive hand. Yes, and she also said, and I quote, Don't let Bailey give you any grief about those dusty old books of hers. This is important family stuff. The familiar burn started in my chest. My dusty old books were my passion, my career. I restored rare manuscripts, a skill that took years of dedication and study. To them, it was a quirky, unprofitable pastime, something to be indulged when I wasn't funding their lifestyles. Fletcher, my older brother, was just as bad, always with some can't miss investment that went belly up or a gambling debt that needed discreet settling. I was the responsible one, the one with the steady, if not glamorous income, the reliable one, the broke one, thanks to them. Caitlin, I'm serious. I don't have $5,000 to spare for an orchestra. But it's an investment in our happiness, Bailey, she whined. Noel will be so disappointed. Don't you want us to be happy? The emotional blackmail, subtle as a sledgehammer. I closed my eyes. I'll see what I can do, I said, the words tasting like ash. It was easier than the inevitable hour-long guilt trip that would follow, probably culminating in a call from Mum anyway. Oh, thank you, Bailey. You're the best. I knew you'd come through. Click. She hung up before I could even attempt to set a boundary. I stared at the peeling paint on my wall. The best meant the biggest pushover. I thought of the grant application I was working on, the one that could lead to a prestigious fellowship, and the hours I'd need to dedicate to it. Hours that would now be spent figuring out how to juggle my finances to appease Caitlin. Again. My phone buzzed again. This time it was an unknown number, but the caller ID showed it was from my parents' landline. Probably Mum, ready to apply more pressure about Caitlin's party. I let it ring, then it stopped. A moment later, it rang again, insistent. With a sigh, I answered, preparing my excuses. Bailey? It was Mum, but her voice was wrong. Not wheedling, not demanding. It was tight, strained, cracking with a raw fear I'd never heard before. Mum? What's wrong? It's it's your father, Bailey. She choked out, a sob tearing through the word. Something's terribly wrong. My own problems, Caitlin's $5,000 orchestra, vanished. What happened? Where are you? The hospital. St. Michael's? He collapsed, Bailey. Oh God, hurry. I didn't bother changing out of my paint stained work clothes. Keys, phone, wallet. I was out the door in 30 seconds, hailing a cab with a frantic wave. St. Michael's was across town, and every red light felt like a personal affront. My mind raced. Dad, Albert, he'd always been distant, a passive figure in our family dramas, mostly observing from behind his newspaper, occasionally grunting in agreement with whatever Vivian decreed. Not unkind exactly, just not particularly present, especially when it came to me. When I burst into the waiting area of the emergency department, the scene was chaotic, but my family was a distinct island of well dressed panic. Vivian was pacing, her usually immaculate makeup smudged, twisting a handkerchief in her hands. Caitlin was slumped in a plastic chair, mascara tracks stark on her pale face, with Noel, her husband, patting her shoulder awkwardly. Even Fletcher, my perpetually irresponsible older brother, looked shaken, his usual cocky smirk replaced by a pasty, worried frown. He was actually on his phone, but for once it didn't look like he was checking sports scores. What's going on? I demanded, my voice breathless. Vivian rushed towards me, grabbing my arm. Oh, Bailey, it's awful, just awful. They took him for more tests, Fletcher mumbled, looking up from his phone. He was complaining about headaches for weeks. Then this morning, he just crumpled. Caitlin let out a fresh wail. They said it looked serious. We waited. The minutes stretched into an eternity, punctuated by Caitlin's sniffles and Vivian's muttered prayers. I found myself studying them. The arrogance, the entitlement I was so used to, had evaporated. In its place was a raw, almost childlike fear. It was unsettling to see them so stripped bare. A small, reluctant flicker of concern for Albert sparked within me. He was still my father, after all. But it was quickly dampened by a wave of old resentments. I remembered when I'd lost out on that research grant a few years back, the one that could have really launched my career. I'd been devastated. When I'd tried to talk to him about it, he'd barely looked up from his golf magazine. Oh well, he'd said, these things happen. Maybe that book dusting thing isn't as secure as you thought. Your mother needs help with the garden this weekend. No comfort, no encouragement, just a swift pivot back to family obligations. A doctor finally emerged, his expression grave. Mrs. Wallace? Vivian practically flew to him. Yes? How is he? What is it? The doctor, a tired looking man with kind eyes, led us to a small private consultation room. The news was brutal. Albert had a rare, aggressive form of vasculitis affecting his brain. The local specialists had consulted, run every test. I'm so sorry, the doctor said, his voice gentle but firm. The inflammation is extensive. At this stage, with this particular variant, the treatment options we can offer here are limited. We're talking about palliative care, managing his comfort. Palliative care. The words hung in the sterile air, heavy and suffocating. Caitlin gasped, a hand flying to her mouth. Fletcher swore under his breath, sinking into a chair. Vivian just stared, her face crumbling. No, she whispered. No, there must be something, some mistake. He's strong, he's a fighter. We've explored all conventional avenues available to us, the doctor said, his gaze compassionate. It's progressing very rapidly. The fight drained out of Vivian. She looked suddenly old, fragile. So that's it? You're just giving up on him? We're not giving up on his comfort, Mrs. Wallace. We'll do everything we can to manage his symptoms. Despair settled over the room. Fletcher was rubbing his temples. Noel was staring blankly at the wall. Caitlin was openly sobbing now. Great, gulping sounds. Vivian, clutching at straws, her voice raspy, said, But isn't there anyone? Anywhere? Some specialist? They said there's one specialist who's done work on these impossible cases. Dr. Pierce. But he's almost a myth. Impossible to reach. Works on experimental treatments, mostly in Europe. My blood ran cold. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. Dr. Seamus Pierce. The name echoed in my head, as familiar to me as the scent of old parchment and binding glue. Dr. Seamus Pierce. It couldn't be a coincidence. The world renowned neurosurgeon, the maverick researcher whose groundbreaking work on rare inflammatory conditions of the brain was legendary, if somewhat controversial. And yes, the very same Dr. Pierce with whom I'd corresponded for the better part of 2 years. It started with a query he'd sent to the archive where I sometimes consulted regarding a passage in a medieval medical manuscript. One query led to another, a shared fascination with the historical intersections of medicine and alchemy. He'd even commissioned me to restore a particularly fragile 15th century herbal for his private collection. He knew my work. He respected it. I kept my face a blank mask, my heart hammering against my ribs. This was a development, a monumental, earth shattering development. Pierce? Fletcher scoffed, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. Yeah, right, like we can just pick up the phone and call some miracle worker in Switzerland. They said he only takes on cases that are, like, scientifically fascinating or whatever, not just this. He gestured vaguely, encompassing the grim reality of Albert's situation. Caitlin, ever practical when it suited her, sniffled. Maybe we could start a GoFundMe for, experimental treatment abroad? If we could even find this Dr. Pierce. Noel chimed in. I could look into medical tourism brokers. Some of them have connections, but it's usually a long shot and incredibly expensive. I watched them, a strange calm settling over me amidst their rising tide of panic. They were flailing, grasping at straws, their usual confidence completely gone. Vivian was staring into space, muttering, Seamus Pierce. I've heard that name. Years ago, a friend of a friend, her husband had something unheard of, but they couldn't get to him. They made calls. Fletcher tried pulling strings with some golf buddy who supposedly knew a hospital administrator. Caitlin frantically Googled Dr. Seamus Pierce contact, her brow furrowed in concentration. Noel was already looking up international flight prices. Each attempt was a dead end. Dr. Pierce, it seemed, was as elusive as the cures he offered. His office isn't listed publicly, Caitlin announced, frustrated. There are some research foundations, but they all say referrals have to come from a primary specialist with a full case file, and even then, it's a review panel. And they said our local team already tried that route, Fletcher added, slumped. He's not taking new consults through official channels right now, apparently. Too busy with some big research project. Vivian wrung her hands. There has to be a way. There has to be. Her gaze, desperate and unfocused, swept the room and landed on me. I was just standing there, observing, a silent spectator to their unraveling. A flicker of something crossed her face, a desperate, grasping hope. Bailey, she said, her voice suddenly sharp, cutting through Caitlin's renewed whimpers. You you deal with all sorts of peculiar people, don't you? With that dusty old book thing you do. I met her gaze, my expression unreadable. Here it comes, I thought. Academics, collectors. You meet odd people, don't you? Anyone in medicine, anyone who might know someone who knows this Dr. Pierce? The question hung in the air, heavy with their collective, desperate hope. The irony was so thick I could have spread it on toast. My silly hobby, the one they'd mocked and belittled for years, the one they'd accused of keeping me from a real job or a proper husband, might now be their only lifeline. For years, my work was a source of amusement, a quaint eccentricity. Now it was suddenly a potential conduit to a miracle. Caitlin and Fletcher stopped their frantic activity, their eyes swiveling to me. Even Noel looked up, a sliver of attention in his usually vacant stare. They were all looking at me, waiting. For the first time in my life, their complete, undivided attention was on me, not because they wanted something I could buy, but because of who I might know through my worthless passion. I let the silence stretch, savoring the weight of their anticipation, their dawning, incredulous hope. I thought of every dismissive comment, every demand, every time my needs were shoved aside for theirs. Finally, I took a slow breath. Dr. Seamus Pierce? I said, my voice calm, almost conversational. Yes, I know him. We've corresponded for years. The collective gasp was audible. Four faces stared at me, utterly, completely stunned into silence. The silence in the small hospital consultation room stretched taut, thick with disbelief. Vivian's hand flew to her chest. Caitlin's jaw literally dropped. Fletcher just blinked, as if I'd suddenly started speaking in ancient Sumerian. You you know him? Vivian finally stammered, her voice a hoarse whisper. Yes, I repeated, keeping my tone level. We have a professional relationship through my restoration work. His his dusty old books? Caitlin breathed, her eyes wide. The derision was gone, replaced by a dawning, desperate awe. Some of them are, indeed, quite dusty, I replied, a faint smile playing on my lips. Fletcher found his voice, a surge of his old impatience returning, albeit laced with a new, urgent deference. Well, what are you waiting for? Call him. Tell him about Dad. It's not quite that simple, Fletcher, I said, my gaze sweeping over their anxious faces. Dr. Pierce is an exceptionally busy man. He doesn't just take casual calls, even from acquaintances. But this isn't a casual call, Bailey, Vivian interjected, stepping forward, her hands clasped beseechingly. This is your father. His life is on the line. You have to help. The old familiar pressure, the guilt trip, but this time it landed differently. It landed on solid ground, not the shifting sands of my usual acquiescence. I understand the urgency, Vivian, I said, but perhaps this isn't the best place to discuss the nuances of how I might approach Dr. Pierce. I glanced around the sterile room. I need to think. Think? Think about what? Caitlin shrieked, jumping to her feet. Dad is dying and you need to think? Noel, ever the echo, added, She's right, Bailey. Time is critical. I looked at them one by one. The fear was still there, but now it was mixed with a frantic expectation, a dawning realization that I, Bailey, the family doormat, held the key. My apartment, I said. We can talk there. I'll head home now. You can follow when you're ready. Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked out, leaving them gaping in my wake. The drive to my tiny, cluttered apartment was a blur. The power of the situation was a heady, terrifying brew. This wasn't just about saving Albert, this was about everything. An hour later, they arrived. All four of them, crammed into my small living space, looking wildly out of place amidst my stacks of books, restoration tools, and the faint, lingering scent of archival paper and old leather. Vivian perched awkwardly on the edge of my worn armchair, the only comfortable seat. Caitlin and Noel stood near the doorway, as if afraid to venture further into such humble surroundings. Fletcher paced restlessly in the limited clear floor space, occasionally bumping into a pile of research papers. The air was thick with their unspoken pleas. So, Vivian began, her voice unnaturally soft, this Dr. Pierce, you're sure you can reach him? I can send him an email, I said. He usually responds to me. An email? Fletcher exploded. Are you kidding me? His father is on death's door and you're going to send an email? Pick up the phone, Bailey. Now! Fletcher, I said, my voice dangerously quiet. Dr. Pierce is currently on a research sabbatical in a very remote part of the Swiss Alps. His direct line is not something one uses lightly. An email is the appropriate first contact. Caitlin wrung her hands. But will he even see it in time? Can't you, I don't know, emphasize the urgency? I remembered Caitlin's urgent need for $5,000 for her anniversary party just that morning. The irony was a bitter pill. I thought of Fletcher's last urgent call, begging me to cover a temporary shortfall, which later turned out to be a hefty gambling loss. That had cost me my emergency fund, the one I'd been saving for a specialized magnification lamp. And Vivian. Oh, Vivian. I recalled the time she'd accidentally donated a box of my carefully curated research notes for a university project to a charity book drive because they were cluttering up the guest room when I'd briefly stored them at her house. It's just old paper, Bailey dear, she'd said with a tinkling laugh when I'd discovered the loss, frantic. Surely you can find more. Their faces were turned to me, masks of desperate entreaty. The people who had dismissed my passion, devalued my work, and drained my resources now looked to that very passion, that very work, as their sole salvation. He's your father, Bailey, Vivian whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Whatever he's done, whatever we've done, please, you can't let him die because of bad feelings. Bad feelings. Such a mild term for years of systematic exploitation and emotional neglect. I let the silence hang, watching them squirm. I saw the forced humility warring with their ingrained entitlement. They were in my world now, on my terms, and they hated it. Finally, I spoke, my voice devoid of any emotion. I'll think about what it would take for me to make that call or send that email. Their eyes widened. Vivian gasped. What? What do you mean, what it would take? Fletcher demanded, his voice rising. I said, standing up, I need to consider the conditions under which I'd be willing to leverage a very significant professional relationship for a personal matter. This is a big ask, even for me. I walked to the door. I need some time alone to consider. I'll let you know my decision. You can see yourselves out. The shock on their faces was exquisite. Disbelief, then outrage, then a dawning, horrified understanding. I held the door open, my expression unyielding. They stumbled out, speechless, into the hallway, leaving me alone in the sudden, blessed quiet of my apartment. The first taste of power was intoxicating. The moment the door clicked shut behind them, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The silence in my apartment was a balm. I walked over to my work table, my fingers tracing the spine of a crumbling 18th century atlas I was meticulously restoring. This was my sanctuary, the place where I had control, where my skills were valued, even if only by myself and a select few. Now, suddenly, that value had skyrocketed in the eyes of the people who'd always treated it as a joke. My first call was to Sonia, my closest friend, the one person who knew the full, unvarnished truth about my family. You will not believe what's happened, I said, sinking onto my sofa, the receiver pressed tight against my ear. I recounted the entire saga. Albert's sudden illness, the grim prognosis, the desperate mention of Dr. Pierce, and the subsequent pilgrimage of my family to my humble abode. Sonia listened patiently, punctuating my story with occasional gasps and indignant snorts. No way, she breathed when I told her about my connection to the elusive surgeon. Bailey, this is karmic gold. Tell me about it, I said, a grim smile playing on my lips. They were practically groveling. It was disgusting and, I have to admit, a little bit satisfying. A little bit? Sonia scoffed. Honey, after what they've put you through, this is your moment. Don't you dare just roll over and make that call without getting something, and I mean something significant, in return. Oh, I have no intention of rolling over, I assured her. That's why I kicked them out. I told them I needed to think about what it would take. Sonia let out a delighted shriek. You didn't! Oh, Bailey, that's brilliant! Their faces! I wish I could have seen their faces. Picture a mixture of apoplectic rage and utter terror, I said dryly. It was quite the tableau. So, what are you going to ask for? Sonia pressed, her voice alight with anticipation. Money? A public apology? Make Caitlin sell that hideous diamond monstrosity Noel bought her? Money is the last thing I want from them, I said. They've already taken enough of that. This isn't about financial compensation. This is about dignity, accountability, making them feel even a fraction of the humiliation they've dished out to me for years. For the next few hours, Sonia and I brainstormed. We dissected every past slight, every egregious demand, every dismissive remark. Each condition we devised was a carefully crafted response to a specific wound. It wasn't about being petty, it was about justice, tailored and precise. Remember when Caitlin borrowed that heirloom necklace your grandmother left you, then lost it at some club, and Vivian said it was just a thing and you were being too sentimental? Sonia reminded me. Oh, I remember, I said, a cold knot forming in my stomach. And Fletcher, Sonia continued, her voice hardening, all those loans for his business ventures that you knew were just feeding his gambling habit, and your mother enabling him, telling you it was your duty as a sister to support his ambitions? The list went on. The time Vivian actively discouraged me from applying for a prestigious curatorial position overseas because family needs you here, Bailey. Who will look after things if you're gallivanting around Europe? The constant mockery of my quiet, scholarly life compared to Caitlin's flashy, materialistic one. Fletcher's casual assumption that my savings were his emergency fund. By the time I hung up with Sonia, a plan had taken shape, cold and clear in my mind. It was audacious. It was ruthless. And it felt absolutely right. There was no guilt, no hesitation, just a steely resolve. This was my one chance to reclaim years of lost dignity, to make them understand the consequences of their actions. They had backed me into a corner for so long, and now the tables had well and truly turned. I spent another hour refining the terms, writing them down on a crisp sheet of paper, each word chosen with deliberate care. Each clause was a perfectly aimed dart designed to pierce their arrogance and force a reckoning. The final list was brutal. It was humiliating. It was, I thought with a grim satisfaction, perfect. I picked up my phone, my hand steady. I scrolled to Vivian's number. It rang twice before she snatched it up, her voice a tight coil of anxiety. Bailey? Have you have you decided? Yes, I said, my voice calm and even. I've decided on my conditions. A shaky sigh of relief on the other end. Oh, thank God. Anything, Bailey. We'll do anything. We'll see about that, I said. Meet me at your house tomorrow. 10 a.m. All of you. Fletcher, Caitlin, Noel, and be prepared to listen. Really listen for once. I didn't wait for her reply. I simply ended the call, a cold, clear certainty settling deep within me. Tomorrow the piper would be paid. The next morning, I walked into my parents' overly ornate living room at precisely 10 o'clock. They were all there, a tableau of strained anxiety. Vivian, Fletcher, Caitlin, and even Noel looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. They sat stiffly on the plush sofas, their eyes fixed on me as I took the armchair opposite them, the one usually reserved for Albert. I placed a single sheet of paper on the polished mahogany coffee table. Thank you for coming, I began, my voice cool and measured. As you know, Albert's condition is critical, and Dr. Seamus Pierce is likely his only hope. I am willing to contact Dr. Pierce on Albert's behalf. However, my willingness comes with certain non negotiable conditions. I let that sink in. Caitlin was already biting her lip, her eyes darting between me and the paper. Fletcher was scowling, his arms crossed tightly. Vivian just looked pale. Condition number one, I continued, my gaze sweeping over them. Caitlin, you will sell the diamond earrings Noel bought you for your birthday last year, the 2 carat ones you were so keen to show off. Caitlin gasped. My earrings? But why? You will use the proceeds from that sale to make a substantial public donation to the National Archives Preservation Fund. The donation will be made in my name, Bailey Wallace. Furthermore, you will accompany this donation with a public statement posted on all your social media accounts explaining that the funds came from the sale of a luxury item and detailing why I, Bailey, chose that specific charity, emphasizing the importance of preserving historical documents and artifacts. Caitlin stared at me, aghast. But those earrings were a gift. They're worth a fortune, and to say it's from you? Precisely, I said. Consider it a contribution to something more lasting than your jewelry box. Condition number two, I went on, turning to Fletcher. You, Fletcher, will write a formal, notarized letter of apology. In this letter, you will confess to the true nature and amounts of every loan you've taken from me over the past 10 years. You will explicitly state that these were not loans for business, but funds to cover gambling debts and, on at least one occasion, bail money. You will acknowledge that you never had any intention of repaying me. Copies of this notarized letter are to be sent to Uncle Jeremiah, Aunt Carol, and your former business ethics professor, Dr. Albright. Fletcher's face turned a mottled shade of red. You can't be serious. That's private. It would ruin me. Your actions had consequences for me, Fletcher. It's time they had consequences for you. Condition number three, I said, my eyes settling on the Vivian. You, Vivian, will host a dinner party. You will invite all our extended family, including Cousin Sarah, Mrs. Henderson from next door, and anyone else who has ever witnessed you mock my career or dismiss my intellect. At this dinner, you will deliver a speech. In this speech, you will praise my intelligence, my dedication, and the valuable and unique nature of my career in manuscript restoration. You will explicitly state how my silly little hobby, as you've so often called it, is now your only hope for Albert's life, and you will publicly apologize for your years of mockery and belittlement. Vivian looked like I'd slapped her. A public speech? Apologizing? To you? In front of everyone? Every word, I confirmed. And finally, I said, pausing for effect, letting the tension build. Condition number four. This one is also for you, Vivienne. I leaned forward slightly. You will confess publicly at that same dinner to sabotaging my application for the fellowship at the Bodleian Library 7 years ago. Vivian's eyes widened in genuine shock, then narrowed. I I don't know what you're talking about. Oh, I think you do, I said, my voice dropping. I think you accidentally failed to mail my final reference letter, the one from Professor Davies, because you didn't want me moving to Oxford. You wanted me to stay here, available, to keep picking up the pieces for this family. You told me he must have forgotten, or it got lost in the post. but I spoke to his widow last year. He kept meticulous records. He gave you that letter, Vivian." The color drained from her face. She opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time, she looked truly frightened, not just of Albert's illness, but of me. Caitlin was openly crying now. "This is insane, Bailey. It's cruel. You're talking about Dad's life." Noel, surprisingly, spoke up. "She has a point. This is a lot. Can't we just pay you or something?" I almost laughed. "Pay me? You think this is about money? This is about respect. This is about truth. This is about consequences." Vivian finally found her voice shrill and laced with fury. You wouldn't let your own father die over this. This bitterness. This vendetta." I met her gaze, my own unwavering, cold as ice. "He's dying now, Vivian, and perhaps his current predicament is the culmination of years of your collective actions, your entitlement, your endless taking, which led us all to this very moment. The choice is yours. My terms, in full, or you find another miracle. You have 1 hour to decide." I left them in the living room and went into the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of water. My hand was perfectly steady. I could hear their voices, muffled but agitated, from the other room. Vivian's rose in a shriek, then Fletcher's, low and angry. Caitlin was definitely sobbing. Noel's voice was a placating murmur, occasionally audible, the sounds of a dynasty crumbling under the weight of its own chickens coming home to roost. 45 minutes later, the door opened. Vivian stood there, her face a mask of defeat. Her shoulders were slumped, her eyes red-rimmed but blazing with a resentful fire. Fletcher and Caitlin trailed behind her, looking equally wretched. Noel just looked exhausted. "All right," Vivian said, her voice flat, devoid of its usual imperious tone. "We agree to all of it." I nodded slowly. "Good. Let's not waste any time then. Caitlin, your earrings. I assume you know a reputable jeweler who gives fair prices for resale." Caitlin flinched but nodded mutely, pulling out her phone. Her fingers, usually so deft as they scrolled through Instagram, fumbled as she searched for a number. Tears streamed down her face as she made the call, her voice cracking as she inquired about selling a pair of 2-carat diamond studs. The pained look on her face as she listened to the initial, undoubtedly lowball offer was a small, bitter amuse-bouche. "Fletcher," I said, turning to him, "your letter. You can use the desk in the study. Pen and paper are in the top drawer. I'll expect a first draft within the hour." He glared at me, his jaw tight, but wordlessly stalked off towards Albert's study. The scratch of a pen, hesitant at first, then more forceful, soon drifted from the room. Vivian sank onto a kitchen chair. "The dinner party," she said, her voice barely a whisper. How how soon?" "Within the week," I replied. "And the guest list needs to be comprehensive. Don't think I won't notice if Cousin Sarah or Mrs. Henderson are conveniently unavailable." She just nodded, staring at her hands. The fight had gone out of her, replaced by a weary, bitter resignation. The next few hours were a surreal parade of capitulation. Caitlin returned from the jeweler, her face pale, clutching a check that was clearly far less than she felt the earrings were worth. She immediately transferred the funds to the Preservation Fund's online portal, her expression thunderous as she typed my name in the "in honor of" field. Then, with me looking over her shoulder, she drafted the social media post, each word of praise for my dedication to preserving history, clearly agony for her to type. Fletcher emerged from the study an hour later, his face grim, holding out a sheet of paper. I read his confession. It was all there: the gambling, the bail, the specific amounts, the admission of no intent to repay. It was brutal, concise, and utterly humiliating. "You'll need to get this notarized first thing tomorrow morning," I said, handing it back. "And then send the copies. I'll want to see the postal receipts." He snatched it from me without a word. Vivian, meanwhile, was making calls, her voice a strained parody of its usual cheerful hostess tone. "Sarah, darling, we're having a little get together. Yes, rather short notice, but it's important. Bailey will be here." The forced brightness was almost painful to listen to. The most significant term, Vivian's confession about the Bodleian Fellowship, hung in the air, unspoken for now, but clearly weighing heavily on her. That would be the centerpiece of her dinner party speech. Once I saw Caitlin's donation confirmation and Fletcher's signed, albeit not yet notarized letter, I decided it was time. These were concrete, irreversible steps. They were truly committing. I pulled out my phone and found Dr. Seamus Pierce's private email address. My fingers flew across the keypad, composing a carefully worded message. I outlined Albert's critical condition, attached the relevant medical files I'd discreetly obtained from the hospital, and respectfully requested his expert opinion, mentioning our previous collaborations on the medieval texts. I didn't reveal a single detail of the family drama, the conditions, the forced humiliations. My communication with him was purely professional. I hit send. Then I turned to my family, who were watching me with a mixture of hope and dread. "The email is sent," I announced. A collective sigh of relief, so profound it was almost a gasp, filled the room. "He's usually quite prompt," I added. We waited. It was only 10 minutes, but it felt like 10 years. Then my phone pinged. An email notification from S. Pierce. My heart leaped. I opened it, read it quickly, then read it again to be sure. I looked up at them. Vivian was twisting her rings. Caitlin was holding her breath. Fletcher was actually still. "He'll review the case files immediately," I said. "He says the preliminary information is intriguing from a research perspective. He'll consult with the local team via video conference tomorrow. If it's what he suspects, he's willing to fly in and operate." Vivian burst into tears, this time of genuine, unadulterated relief. Caitlin let out a choked sob. Even Fletcher managed a shaky smile. I let them have their moment. Then, as Vivian reached for her phone, presumably to update the hospital, I cleared my throat. "He'll help," I confirmed, my voice cutting through their fragile joy. I watched their faces, the hope still shining in their eyes. "Now, about the remaining conditions before he arrives. Specifically, Vivian, the dinner party, and your speech. I believe you have some calls to make to finalize that guest list. And Fletcher, the notary's office opens at 9. The brief flicker of relief on their faces died, replaced by the familiar dread. The price for their miracle was still being exacted. Dr. Pierce was as good as his word. He flew in 3 days later, a whirlwind of quiet authority and intense focus. The surgery was long and complex, but ultimately successful. Albert began the slow, arduous process of recovery, blissfully unaware of the gauntlet his family had run to secure the services of the brilliant surgeon by his bedside. He just knew Bailey had pulled some strings with a contact from her book world. He seemed genuinely, if vaguely, grateful. The dinner party, however, was an event for the ages. Vivian, pale but resolute, stood before a stunned assembly of relatives and acquaintances. Cousin Sarah's eyes were like saucers. Mrs. Henderson almost choked on her canapé. Vivian's voice trembled as she delivered her pre approved speech, praising my intellect, my invaluable and unique career, and the supreme irony of how my dusty old books had saved Albert's life. Her apology for years of mockery was stilted but clear. Then came the pièce de résistance, her confession about the Bodleian Fellowship. A collective gasp rippled through the room. You could have heard a pin drop. The shame radiating from her was a palpable force. Fletcher, who had dutifully sent his notarized confessions, spent the evening avoiding eye contact with Uncle Jeremiah, who looked at him with a new, profound disappointment. Caitlin, her social media post having gone mildly viral amongst their circle, accompanied by a flurry of confused and pitying comments, endured the whispers and sidelong glances with a stoic misery. The facade of the perfect, entitled family had not just cracked, it had shattered. In the weeks that followed Albert's return home, a new fragile order began to establish itself. The atmosphere in the family home when I visited to check on Albert was different. Strained, yes. Formal, definitely. But the casual dismissiveness, the ingrained expectation that I would cater to their every whim, was gone. Replaced, it seemed, by a wary, almost fearful respect. Caitlin once tried, out of habit, to ask me to just quickly look over a ridiculously expensive quote for re landscaping her prize winning rose garden. "I'm a bit busy with a new restoration project, Caitlin," I said, my voice pleasant but firm. "Perhaps Noel could help you with that." The flicker of her old entitlement died in her eyes, replaced by a hasty, "Oh, right, yes, of course." Fletcher, surprisingly, started talking about getting a real estate license. He even asked me, very politely, if I knew any good introductory courses. I offered no financial assistance, just a neutral. "That sounds like a sensible path, Fletcher. I'm sure you can find resources online." He didn't push. Vivian was the most changed. She was quieter, more solicitous towards Albert, and almost timid around me. The imperious matriarch was a ghost. She once tentatively asked if I'd like her to clear out that old box of papers in the attic, clearly a peace offering related to my lost research notes. No, thank you, Vivian, I said. I've moved on from that, but I appreciate the thought. Her relief was almost comical. My life settled back into its familiar rhythms, but with a profound internal shift. The constant, low level anxiety of anticipating the next family demand was gone. My savings account, for the first time in years, was actually growing. I poured my energy into my work, securing two new exciting commissions. The fellowship I'd lost out on years ago was a distant memory. New opportunities, ones I could pursue without familial sabotage, were on the horizon. Sonia, of course, was ecstatic. You did it, Bailey, she said, raising a glass when we met for coffee. You actually did it. Justice, served cold, with a side of public humiliation. I smiled. It was satisfying. And it was. The revenge had been sweet, the justice deeply cathartic. My family bond wasn't magically healed, it was irrevocably broken and then reforged into something entirely new. Something colder, more distant, but also, paradoxically, more honest. They had Albert back? Yes. But they had lost their power over me. They had to live with the public knowledge of their past deeds, the shame of their forced confessions. That was their karma. Some might say I was harsh, unforgiving. Some might argue that family should be unconditional, but those people hadn't lived my life. They hadn't been the walking ATM, the emotional dumping ground, the perpetually undervalued daughter and sister. My family had built the cage I was in, brick by brick, with their own hands. I'd simply used the one tool they inadvertently gave me, my silly hobby, to dismantle it. I had no regrets. I had my dignity. I had my peace. And for the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt truly, unequivocally free. That, I realized, was worth more than any $5,000 orchestra or 2 carat diamond. It was priceless.